The Justice Department has now released a big new batch of documents in the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, and these include new details about Epstein's one-time friendship with President Trump. Look, there is a lot to go through. We said it's like more than 10,000 pages, so we are digging through this, but this is what is seen so far. In a 2020 email, an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York wrote that Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet, quote, more times than previously has been reported, at least 8 times between 1993 and 96. And on a flight in 1993, according to the email, there was just 3 passengers: Trump, Epstein, and what's described as a 20-year-old woman. Being mentioned in a trove of investigatory documents does not demonstrate criminal wrongdoing, a reminder, and Trump has not been accused of being involved in Epstein's crimes.
I want to make something clear before we go a single step further. This is not a story about whether Donald Trump committed a crime. The documents released so far do not allege that. No federal prosecutor has charged him. No indictment has been filed. If you came here looking for a conviction narrative, this video is not that, and any channel that's selling you that narrative based on these files is misreading them deliberately. What this story actually is, however, is in some ways more precise and more verifiable than a criminal allegation, because this is a story about a documented contradiction between a specific public statement made by a sitting president and a specific internal document created by that same president's own federal prosecutors in his own administration's investigation. That distinction matters. Criminal allegations require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, witnesses, a jury, a verdict. A documented contradiction between a presidential public claim and a federal prosecutorial record requires none of those things. The document either says what it says or it doesn't. The president either said what he said or he didn't. The flight records either show his name or they don't. In this case, the answer to all 3 questions is unambiguous, and that's what we're going to walk through, methodically, without embellishment, without implication, and without the kind of association by adjacency journalism that lets the reader's imagination do the work the evidence hasn't earned. My name is Matthew John Turner. The documents are in the public record. Let's read them correctly.
The president did seem dismayed that the release of any and all of these files, though, could harm the reputations of individuals he said, quote, innocently met Epstein. Now, remember, he is the man they also signed into law last month, the measure requiring the Justice Department to do just this, release the files.
A lot of people are very angry that pictures are being released of other people that really had nothing to do with Epstein, but they're in a picture with him because he was at a party. And you ruin a reputation of somebody.
The Southern District of New York email was written on January 7th, 2020. The author is an assistant United States attorney whose name is redacted in the released version. The recipient is also redacted. The document was produced during the active federal prosecution of Ghislaine Maxwell for her role in Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking operation. The SDNY had received, as part of the Maxwell investigation's evidentiary record, over 100 pages of flight logs written in what the email describes as very small script. A federal prosecutor reviewed those records. In the course of that review, the prosecutor found Donald Trump listed as a passenger on Epstein's private aircraft on at least 8 occasions between 1993 and 1996. The email documented specific details. At least 4 of the 8 flights also had Ghislaine Maxwell on board, the same Ghislaine Maxwell who is now serving a 20-year federal prison sentence for child sex trafficking conspiracy, enticement of minors, and related charges. One flight had Trump, his then-wife Marla Maples, and other passengers. Other flights included Tiffany Trump and Eric Trump. One flight in 1993 carried exactly 3 passengers: Trump, Epstein, and a woman described as 20 years old, whose name is redacted in the release document. The email closes with a statement that has drawn particular attention from legal analysts and journalists reviewing the files. The prosecutor wrote that the team did not want any of this to be a surprise down the road. I want to spend a moment on that phrase because it is doing specific institutional work that is important to understand. This is not a whistleblower disclosure. It is not a leak to a journalist. It is an internal memo from a career prosecutor to a colleague, almost certainly a supervisor or a parallel investigative unit. flagging that Trump's name appears in the evidentiary record of the Maxwell prosecution and that those records will be visible if and when the case goes to trial. The institutional purpose of the communication is prophylactic. We know this is in the file. We are documenting that we know. We do not want anyone in this office blindsided when it surfaces. That is entirely standard operating procedure for career prosecutors navigating an investigation that touches on the name of a sitting president. It is document management. It is professional due diligence. And it is absolutely not an allegation of criminal conduct. But here is the specific significance of the document regardless of what it does not allege. The SDNY email was written in January 2020. The author was a career federal prosecutor. The author worked for the Department of Justice during Donald Trump's first presidential term. The investigation was being run by Trump's own DOJ. The flight records that served as the evidentiary basis for the email were obtained in the ordinary course of a federal investigation. This was not opposition research. This was not a politically motivated leak. This was a federal employee documenting factual findings from primary source evidence in an active federal prosecution. That provenance matters enormously when you evaluate what the document means. The 2024 Truth Social post and why it created a verifiable problem on Truth Social in 2024. Donald Trump wrote, and I am going to quote this precisely because precision matters here. I was never on Epstein's plane or at his stupid island. Epstein was a customer of mine at Mar-a-Lago, which I terminated years before his arrest. I had no relationship with Epstein. Those are three distinct factual claims. The first is about physical presence on the aircraft, never on Epstein's plane. The second is about the nature of the relationship, Epstein as a customer, the relationship as transactional and terminated. The third is a categorical denial of any relationship at all. The SDNY email directly addresses the first claim. Career prosecutors reviewed actual flight records. Those records showed Trump as a passenger on at least 8 Epstein flights. The federal prosecutors documented this in writing in January 2020. The document has now been released into the public record under a law Trump signed. These two statements, never on the plane, and 8 documented flights in a federal prosecutor's review of actual flight records, cannot simultaneously be true. One of them is false. The flight records are primary source documents. They are the kind of evidence that federal courts accept as foundational. The Truth Social post is a public statement made by a private individual on his own platform. When a presidential public statement directly contradicts documented findings by career federal prosecutors reviewing primary source evidence, that contradiction is newsworthy regardless of whether it implies criminal conduct, and it is the specific newsworthy fact at the center of this story. What the DOJ disclaimer does and doesn't cover. When the Justice Department released this batch of documents on December 23rd, it issued a statement saying that some materials in the release contain untrue and sensationalist claims made against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. That disclaimer is legitimate and worth taking seriously, but only as applied to the specific category of documents it accurately describes, and understanding exactly which documents that is requires reading carefully. Among the released files was a letter purportedly written by Jeffrey Epstein to disgraced former sports medicine physician Larry Nassar, which contained crude references to Trump. Within hours of the release, the FBI determined the letter was fabricated. It was postmarked from Virginia 3 days after Epstein's death in custody. The return address omitted his inmate number. The handwriting did not match Epstein's documented samples. Someone created a false document and submitted it to the FBI. That false document became part of the investigative file. The file was released. The fabrication propagated. That is a real and important cautionary example. These files contain thousands of tips, complaints, and allegations submitted by members of the public. Some of those allegations are credible and documented. Some are the product of someone who wanted to be part of the Epstein story and fabricated a submission. Both categories exist in the same release. Distinguishing between them requires exactly the kind of forensic reading that responsible journalists are applying to these materials. The SDNY email is not in the category the DOJ disclaimer covers. It is not a public complaint submitted before an election. It is not an unverified allegation from a member of the public. It is an internal prosecutorial communication created in January 2020, 10 months before the presidential election the DOJ references, by a career prosecutor who was reviewing actual primary source flight records in the course of an active federal investigation. The DOJ's preemptive disclaimer about election-adjacent false allegations has no application whatsoever to a January 2020 internal SDNY memo from the Maxwell prosecution team. The disclaimer is designed to contaminate the credibility of Trump-related documents across the entire release. It is effective as a rhetorical strategy precisely because it is partially legitimate. There are fabricated documents in the files, but the SDNY email is not one of them, and conflating them, allowing the disclaimer to cast a shadow over a document it factually does not apply to, is exactly the kind of imprecision that makes these stories harder to understand clearly. The 2002 quote and the rhetorical work the word innocently is doing Trump's response to the document release, expressing concern about reputations, describing his connection to Epstein as innocent, needs to be evaluated against the existing public record of the relationship, not treated as the starting point for understanding it. In 2002, Trump gave an interview to New York Magazine in which he described Epstein in the following terms: "I've known Jeff for 15 years, terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. That is not an innocent description of a passing acquaintance." It is a warm endorsement of a friend's personality offered voluntarily to a journalist in the specific register of male social bonding, and it includes a specific noted observation about the youth of the women Epstein preferred. Trump made that statement. It is in the public record. It was made 4 years before Epstein's 2006 arrest in Florida, but 13 years after the 1993 flight that appears in the SDNY email. The word innocently in Trump's 2025 statement, "I innocently met Epstein," is doing specific rhetorical work. It is a preemptive framing of the entire relationship as incidental and unknowing, not just that no wrongdoing occurred, which may well be factually true, but that the contact was innocent in character, without knowledge of who Epstein was or what he was doing. The 2002 New York Magazine quote doesn't support that framing. The 8 documented flights between 1993 and 1996 don't support that framing. 15 years of documented social relationship doesn't support the characterization of the connection as an innocent meeting. On the Mar-a-Lago ban, which Trump has repeatedly cited as evidence of principled disassociation, the documented account of why Epstein was removed from the club involves a specific incident in which Epstein allegedly made inappropriate advances toward the teenage daughter of a Mar-a-Lago member. The ban was a response to a problem Epstein created at Trump's property. It was not a moral reckoning with who Epstein was. The disassociation was triggered by a specific behavioral incident, not by a dawning awareness of Epstein's predatory conduct as a general matter. None of that constitutes a criminal allegation, but it does constitute relevant context for evaluating the accuracy and completeness of the innocently met Epstein framing. The specific irony of Trump signing this law, in November 2025, Donald Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act into law. The political logic of that signing was reasonably clear at the time. The demand for Epstein file release had been driven primarily by the MAGA media ecosystem and congressional Republicans who believed, based on years of conspiracy theory infrastructure built around Epstein's death in federal custody, that the files would expose a vast network of Democratic-aligned powerful men who had been protected from accountability by the deep state. The client list narrative, the Democratic establishment, the Clinton circle, Bill Gates, the liberal elite, these were the names the base was promised. This was the accountability moment that had been years in the making. Signing the transparency law was a political win. It positioned Trump as the one finally willing to rip the cover off what the deep state had been hiding. The law required the DOJ to release materials it had been holding. Trump signed it. The DOJ released the files. And the files that came out contained prominently Trump's name on 8 flights on Epstein's aircraft, Elon Musk's name in emails to Epstein discussing the possibility of visiting his island, and Howard Lutnick, Trump's own Commerce Secretary, whose name appears in the documents, though Lutnick has emphatically and categorically denied ever meeting Epstein. The files that the MAGA ecosystem demanded in order to expose the Democratic establishment are, in their actual contents, illuminating the social world of powerful men broadly, including men in and around Trump's own orbit. There is no client list. The July 7, 2025 DOJ memo said this explicitly. No incriminating client list exists in the documents. The revelation that the base was promised did not materialize in the form it was expected. What materialized instead was a forensic picture of Epstein's social network that includes figures across ideological lines, with Trump's name appearing in some of the most specific and well-sourced documents in the release. This is the particular political predicament Trump's "a lot of people are very angry" framing is attempting to navigate. He cannot credibly argue against the release. He signed the law. He cannot dismiss the base's demand for transparency. He was the one who positioned himself as the transparency champion. So the rhetorical strategy available to him is to reframe the release as collateral damage to innocent people, to position himself as one of those innocently connected individuals, and to express sympathy for unnamed others whose reputations are being harmed by documents that were intended to expose the guilty. The framing is not without merit in the abstract. There are genuine innocent people in these files. People whose names appear because they attended the same events as Epstein, or because someone submitted a fabricated allegation to the FBI. That concern is real and worth acknowledging. But a president whose own name appears in 8 flights in a federal prosecutor's internal memo expressing concern that innocent people are being harmed by the disclosure of Epstein connections is making an argument that the specific factual record makes difficult to sustain at face value. How to read 10,000 pages, and what most people will actually absorb. The scale of this release deserves direct attention because it shapes how the story will function in the public conversation, regardless of what the documents actually contain. Across multiple batches, more than 3 million pages have been released. The December 23rd drop alone was over 10,000 pages. The investigative files span years, jurisdictions, and categories ranging from credible prosecutorial documents produced in active federal investigations to FBI 302 interview memos to public complaint submissions that include fabricated materials. The size of the release is a direct reflection of the size of the investigation, not just of Epstein as an individual, but of the trafficking network he operated and the years of investigative work that network generated. Most of those pages will never be read by most people. The investigation files are internally inconsistent. They require contextual knowledge of the Maxwell prosecution, the SDNY's evidentiary record, the timeline of the Florida state case, and the jurisdictional complexities of how multiple federal and state investigations overlapped. Reading them accurately requires the kind of sustained analytical attention that a news cycle optimized for immediate reaction is structurally ill-suited to provide. What will shape the public narrative are the documents that produce clear, summarizable, headline-ready contradictions. Trump flew on Epstein's jet 8 times is that kind of document. It is specific, it is documented in primary source form, and it directly contradicts a specific presidential public statement. That is why it leads the coverage. Not because it is necessarily the most legally significant document in the release, it may not be, but because it is the clearest example of the documentary record contradicting a presidential claim. The discipline required here, and it is a genuine discipline, not a rhetorical gesture toward balance, is to maintain the distinction between what the document establishes and what it implies. The SDNY email establishes that Trump flew on Epstein's plane at least 8 times. It does not establish what occurred on those flights. It does not allege that Trump was aware of or participated in any criminal conduct. It does not connect Trump to any of Epstein's victims. It documents a travel and social relationship that was more extensive than publicly acknowledged. That is what the evidence supports. Nothing more, nothing less. Covering the contradiction between the flight records and the presidential denial does not require suggesting criminal conduct. It requires noting that a specific factual claim made by the president is directly contradicted by the findings of his own administration's prosecutors reviewing primary source evidence. That is not an insinuation. It is a factual statement about two contradictory records. The provenance argument, why his own DOJ matters. I want to return to the provenance of the SDNY email one final time because I think it is the single most underappreciated element of why this document is significant. The email was written on January 7th, 2020. The Trump administration was in office. The DOJ was run by Trump-appointed leadership. The SDNY was operating under that DOJ. The Maxwell prosecution was a federal case being run by career prosecutors, not political appointees, career employees, within the institutional structure of an executive branch controlled by Trump. The prosecutor who wrote the email was not a Democratic operative, was not working for an opposition research firm, was not a journalist with an agenda, was a federal employee working within the chain of command of Trump's own Justice Department, reviewing evidence in an active federal investigation and documenting findings in the ordinary course of prosecutorial work. The document that now directly contradicts Trump's claim that he was never on Epstein's plane was created by Trump's own government, in Trump's own investigation, by Trump's own prosecutors, using primary source evidence those prosecutors were legally authorized to review, and the law that put it into the public record was signed by Trump himself. The trajectory of this specific document, from career prosecutors' internal memo in January 2020, to evidence in the Maxwell prosecution, to sealed DOJ file, to public record under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, runs entirely through institutions and decisions controlled by Trump at every stage. He did not leak it. He did not authorize its publication against his interests. He signed the law that made it inevitable, likely because the political calculus of the signing looked favorable before anyone had carefully audited what was in the files. That is not an accusation of stupidity or malice. It is a description of how document releases at this scale work in practice. You sign the law. The law produces outputs you did not fully anticipate. The outputs are now in the public record, and the public record now contains a documented discrepancy between your own words and your own government's findings. Let me state the record precisely, because that is the only responsible way to close this story. What the documents establish: Trump flew on Jeffrey Epstein's private aircraft at least 8 times between 1993 and 1996. This was documented in a January 7th, 2020 internal email by a career SDNY prosecutor reviewing over 100 pages of primary source flight records as part of the active federal prosecution of Ghislaine Maxwell. At least 4 of those 8 flights also had Maxwell on board. One flight in 1993 carried Trump, Epstein, and a 20-year-old woman whose name is redacted. The prosecutor flagged these findings internally to prevent institutional surprises if they surfaced at trial. What the documents do not establish: any criminal conduct by Trump, any connection between Trump and Epstein's victims, any allegation that Trump was present at or aware of any criminal activity. The SDNY email is a prosecutorial document management memo, not an accusation. What the 2024 Truth Social post said: Trump was never on Epstein's plane. What those two records do together: create a specific, documented, unambiguous contradiction between a presidential public statement and the findings of career federal prosecutors reviewing primary source evidence during Trump's own first administration. The DOJ disclaimer about untrue and sensationalist pre-election allegations does not apply to a January 2020 internal SDNY memo. The fake letter about Nassar is a different document in a different category. The evidentiary standard for the SDNY email is not comparable to an unverified public complaint.